Look, we've seen these reports that analysts feel a US flight has come over from America and brought nuclear weapons with it to the UK, stationing them here for the first time in more than a decade. What is the significance of that if it has happened?
Well, if this has happened, it would be significant in a few ways. Firstly, of course, it's politically and strategically significant that for the first time in the best part of 2 decades, American nuclear weapons are being stationed on British soil. Secondly, it has important ramifications for the recent announcement by the government that the UK intends to join NATO's DCA program and become an operator of airborne nuclear weapons, which can be employed in a tactical role. This, of course, underpinned the recent decision to procure the F-35A. Since the nuclear weapons that are used as part of the DCA program are American weapons, their basing in the UK would be indicative of a shift in the direction of the UK joining the program. At an alliance-wide level, the existence of more tactical nuclear weapons in Europe closes an important gap in allied deterrence at the European level, namely the fact that Russia has far more tactical and sub-strategic nuclear weapons than NATO does, and that in a conflict, the limited use of nuclear weapons in Europe by Russia might be perceived as strategically advantageous because the alliance might be presented with what one former US Secretary of Defense during the Cold War described as the suicide or surrender dilemma. So adding a bit of flexibility to NATO's escalation ladder is the third function that this decision would have.
Just take us through the difference there, because we have tactical and strategic weapons. You're saying that this could be a potential for a de-escalation in many ways.
In certain ways, or at least a mechanism for deterring Russia from the belief that through the use of low-yield nuclear weapons against very specific targets in Europe, it could coerce the alliance into concluding a war on terms favorable to Russia, because the alliance's options would be escalation to strategic level nuclear exchanges,
which are far more powerful.
Indeed, and which a policymaker would find very difficult to fathom, especially in response to the use of tactical nuclear weapons against potentially military targets. And the alternative, equally unpalatable in its own way, would be doing nothing or de-escalating on Russian terms. So having a commensurate response is of considerable deterrent value.
And what's the benefit here for the UK if we do now, as the analysts say we may do, have these US weapons on our shores?
So I think there's 2 benefits. Firstly, of course, to the extent that this strengthens the ability of the US to use its own nuclear weapons as part of the alliance, that has net benefits for all allies in Europe, including the UK. But secondly, if, as the government wishes, the UK is to join the DCA program, it will in all likelihood be reliant on American gravity bombs in order to generate tactical nuclear options, which will need to be under the supervision of American personnel, as in all other instances within the program. And the basing of these weapons at Lakenheath essentially sets the conditions in material terms for the UK joining the program. So it complements the F-35A buy.
Is there a risk that Lakenheath then becomes a potential target for Russia?
Yes, that is a real risk, but given the significant concentrations of U.S. Air Force air power at RAF Lakenheath already under the 48th Fighter Air Wing, frankly, in any war in Europe, Lakenheath would probably be a very important target for Russia in any case. So, arguably, this changes very little.
These are described as gravity bombs. Just explain their power, what they can do.
Right. So these gravity bombs are essentially free fall bombs, as opposed to powered weapons like cruise or ballistic missiles. The utility of a bomb like the B-61 is twofold. But primarily it resides in the fact that it has a dialable yield. So depending on the amount of the yield booster used within the bomb, one can have a detonation ranging from a few kilotons to, depending on whose estimates one uses, tens of kilotons. That dialable yield has considerable strategic value because it means that the bomb could be used in a commensurate response to a Russian low-yield strike against an equally valuable Russian military target with relatively low fallout and relatively low strategic ramifications for Russia as a society, or it could be used with a higher yield against a more strategically significant target. So it's the flexibility of the weapon is its primary value.
Are they based anywhere else in Europe?
Yes, so the other users of or the other participants in the DCA program would also use U.S. gravity or would also plan for and support the planning for the use of U.S. gravity bombs.
And for the UK, we've often, I think, well, in my lifetime, certainly we've thought of our nuclear deterrent as being mostly submarine-based. It does feel like we're about to move into this stage where, with the order of these F-35A aircraft, that we would have an air deterrent as well. Is that your understanding from that?
Yes, very much so. So the strategic deterrent, the mechanism for deterring, for example, a direct attack on the homeland or major metropolitan areas is still very much Trident. It's still very much submarine-based deterrent. But for lower yield tactical options, it's likely that the UK will rely on air-launched options, and that distinction, the use of two different delivery mechanisms for different parts of the deterrent, is rather important because one wishes to convey to the other side the nature of one's response. So the fact that it's coming from an aircraft in the form of a gravity bomb rather than, on the same ballistic missile that might carry a strategic warhead is an important mechanism for, in the event one has to use these capabilities, signaling to the other side that one is engaging in a commensurate response rather than, for example, a full-scale strategic escalation.
And the fact this has happened now, is that just a sign of how serious this threat from Russia is being taken?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the issue of the gap in sub-strategic and tactical nuclear weapons with Russia has been a structural one in terms of Europe's defense architecture for quite some time. But the issue, of course, has been considered before this point. But the threat has become regarded as especially acute in recent years. In light of Russia's behavior in Ukraine, the frequent nuclear threats made by Russian policymakers, and so on.
And how will Russia view this if they do know that this has happened?
I suspect the Russians probably expected some form of growth in terms of the US's nuclear capabilities in Europe, and they'll probably view the development in conjunction with the growth of with both the modernization of some of the US's strategic capabilities, but also the emplacement in Europe of conventional capabilities like Typhoon and Dark Eagle in Germany from 2026 onwards, which the Russians regard as potentially having a nuclear or nuclear-adjacent role. They will probably view this as as part of a wider set of developments, which is going to see the US's theater-level nuclear posture in Europe bolstered significantly. And in the context of that wider set of developments, it's likely to be a matter of some concern to them.
But they won't feel it's unexpected.
Not necessarily, no. Of course, it's hard to say with any degree of certainty whether they were necessarily expecting this specific decision, but to a significant degree, the Russians have for a long time fretted about the possibility of the US bolstering its theater-level nuclear capabilities, and to them this will likely be an unwelcome but not necessarily entirely unexpected outcome.
And say this has happened, I mean, the UK and the US understandably aren't commenting right now. Do you think we could see further nuclear weapons coming from the US in the future, or does this feel like a distinct act?
it's difficult to say with absolute certainty what the number of nuclear weapons the US would wish to base at Lakenheath would be. What one could say, though, is that given the scale of the gap between the NATO and Russia in terms of theater-level nuclear weapons, we're likely to see accelerating efforts to either close or offset this gap in Europe going forward. And that might mean the emplacement of more tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, or it might mean things like the development of conventional strike capabilities, things like, or the fielding in Europe of conventional strike capabilities like Typhoon and Dark Eagle, amongst others, that can play some of the role, that can play some of the roles nuclear weapons can, or that can be used in a way that's asymmetrical, but which nonetheless offsets the Russian advantage in sub-strategic nuclear weapons. So I expect efforts in this area to certainly accelerate in the next decade, but whether that means more tactical nuclear weapons remains to be seen.
And just finally, RAF Lakenheath is now, again, a key part of this nuclear deterrent. Tell me about the base there, what it serves, what the US have done to prepare for what we think has happened, which is US weapons going there.
Yeah, so RAF Lakenheath has historically served as an important sort of hub for U.S. air power in Europe. The 48th Air Wing at the base has played a historically important role, and the F-15s and F-35As are under its control represent a major concentration of U.S. air power in the region. It's also historically been a site for the storage of US tactical nuclear weapons in the UK. In terms of what the Americans have done, obviously it's difficult to say with certainty, but it is notable that in a financial year 2024 budgetary request, the U.S. Air Force spoke of the construction of surety dormitories at Lakenheath, using language around the subject of surety, which is typically reserved for matters related to nuclear weapons, which suggests that structural changes to the facility may well have either begun or are underway to enable it to host nuclear weapons.
And a surety dormitory is a shield?
No. So in this instance, the specific use of the word surety is what was viewed by some analysts as a linguistic cue rather than necessarily the specific facility.
Well, that's all really interesting. Sidharth Kaushal from the Royal United Services Institute, thank you very much for your time.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.